The reading this morning is taken from Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse 18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with God's will. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, good morning. It's a difficult topic this morning. Why is there so much suffering in the world, and how long have I got? Would probably be the next question. It's a question that many people have asked, and as I go door to door visiting occasionally in Billericay, and as I've done it in other places too, it's been a question that people would say that they would often want to ask of God. Why is there so much suffering? Some people say, and I wonder if you've ever said this, some people say to me, everything happens for a reason. Have you ever said that yourself? Have you ever thought it? And whilst I agree that, of course, there are reasons and events behind everything that happens, I actually don't agree with what often lies behind that belief. Because usually when people say everything happens for a reason, they basically mean that what has happened was meant to be. And I don't believe that everything that happens is what was meant to be. Muslims would agree with such a statement because they say that everything that happens is Allah's will. So if I jump up in the air and fall down and break my leg, that was meant to be, a Muslim would say. That was Allah's will. If a child begins to cross the road and gets hit by a car, that was Allah's will. It was meant to be. I do not believe that everything that happens was meant to be. When a tsunami hit Japan in March 2011, killing 15,000 people, was that God's will? No. When a coal waste tip slid down the mountainside in Aberfan in 1966, killing 144 people, including 116 children, was that God's will? No. Does everything happen for a reason? No, not in the way that I think people often say that. But I do believe that in everything that happens, God works for the good of those who love him. And that was how our Bible reading ended, Romans 8, verse 28. God works for the good of those who love him. When life is hard, God is at work. When suffering comes, as it will come to us all, God is at work. When there seems to be no answers to our questions, God is always at work for the good of those who love him. The author and church minister Ray Ortlund says this. He says, sometimes there is no way to get out of suffering, but there is a way to get through suffering. because God is the ally of sufferers. He also says that trust in God, not an explanation from God, is the pathway through suffering. Trust in God, not an explanation from God, is the pathway through suffering. So why is there so much suffering? Tsunamis, earthquakes, floods, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the brutal killings in Syria, bereavement, sickness, depression, loneliness, severe temptation, they all remind us that suffering is global and it's local and it's personal. Philosophers and theologians have grappled with this question for centuries without ever really discovering a completely satisfactory answer. But it's a stumbling block to belief in God for some people. So we need to try to understand the issue better. And as always, the scriptures encourage us to be ready to give a reason for the hope that we have to others. We find that in 1 Peter 3, verse 15. But before we go any further, I think it's important to draw a distinction between suffering for Christ, suffering for the sake of Christ, and other kinds of sickness, disaster, illness and suffering. Because to suffer for Christ is to be persecuted, perhaps even martyred for professing and living out faith in Jesus. It is to suffer for the way of Christ, for the cross. And today's Bible reading began like this: I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And St. Paul was referring there primarily to persecution. Next Sunday evening, our study of the Beatitudes arrives at Matthew 5, verse 10, as my body double said earlier, where Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." When the New Testament refers to suffering, it's nearly always on account of persecution, as a result of living a life of faithful discipleship, following Christ. And to be fair, that kind of suffering demands its own talk, or probably a series of talks. But that's not my main purpose today. So I'm primarily, but not exclusively, talking or referring to other kinds of sickness and pain, bereavement, loneliness, human disasters, that kind of suffering. Because it's the type of suffering that leads some people to say, surely if there was a God, he would not allow these things to happen. So having made that distinction, I think it's perhaps then helpful to say something about two false teachings that exist in parts of the worldwide church. One says that sickness is always due to personal sin. The other says that suffering is a gift. They are both wrong. They are both false teachings. But I think I do need to say just a little bit about both of those. So first of all, the so-called prosperity gospel, it's especially prevalent in some parts of the... Hello? We haven't quite got to there yet. I think we're probably... where are we? 5, 4... We're probably on a blank screen at the moment, I think. Yeah. Excellent. We've had plenty of blank screens, haven't we? Don't keep it on there. The so-called prosperity gospel, it's especially prevalent in some parts of the United States and in parts of Africa. And it says that God wants to bless you, to make you rich, to bless you always with good health and with old age. And there's perhaps nothing too shocking about that, because those things are blessings. But it also... it's a false gospel because it teaches or encourages that sickness, poverty and poor health are a sign that God is not blessing you. And that is not true. That is a false gospel. It's a false gospel. It's a return to a teaching that existed in parts of Judaism during the ministry of Jesus and in parts of the Old Testament as well. On one occasion, Jesus healed a blind man who had been born blind. And his disciples wanted to know, well, whose sin caused this man's blindness? Was it his mother's? Was she a terrible woman? Was it his father's sin? Was he a terrible man? Was it his sin? Whose wrongdoings were to blame? And it's a trap that we sometimes fall into as well, trying to work out a kind of a black and white reason behind sickness or disappointment or poverty. Go back to what I said earlier. Everything happens for a reason. Well, actually, no, I don't think it does. Not the kind of reason that we often mean behind that. It's a trap we sometimes fall into. Why am I sick? Why has this happened to me? Jesus said, neither the man's father nor the man's mother had sinned, but it was a case where God could be glorified through the man's healing. The Old Testament book of Job, and I referred to that when we were worshipping, singing Blessed Be the Name of the Lord. The Old Testament book of Job was written to counter a wrong approach to personal misfortune. Job was once rich. He was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had sons and daughters. He had a huge successful farm. And on one single day, Job lost his thousands of animals, all his servants and all his children in 4 separate terrible disasters. Job's response was to tear his robe and shave his head as a sign of grief and bereavement. But he also got down on his knees, using those words that we find in that song written by Matt and Beth Redman. Job, filled with grief and worship, said, hopefully it will now appear. Has it gone again? Okay, we have a problem, Houston. No idea. We do know that the bulb is about to go, and that's why we've ordered one which is being delivered and installed in a couple of weeks' time. So it could be a problem with the bulb about to go. Job, filled with grief, said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Next, Job became seriously ill with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. His wife told him to curse God. His friends tried in vain to identify what is it that Job has done wrong. What are the sins, the secret sins that he's committed to lead to such terrible suffering and illness? But the book of Job is not so much about why God seems to allow suffering. It's much more about how we should respond to suffering. A second false teaching that is around in some parts of the church says that suffering is a gift to be thankful for. Now, please remember that I'm not talking here about persecution or suffering for living a life of faith in Jesus. Because suffering in that respect, says Jesus, is a blessing. But a false teaching is that sickness, loss, grief and disasters should somehow be received as a gift, sent by God to test us or develop us or improve us. Now, it's true that God can and does work in and through all of those situations for our good. That is true. God is at work in all of them for our good, but he doesn't, as a rule, send them. It doesn't mean he's given them to us as some kind of gift. Sickness, pain, tears and disappointment will one day be wiped away forever. And God is in the business of using us to wipe them away now as far as we can. So I don't find anything in the Bible that says that God regularly sends sickness and other suffering for our benefit or as a gift. In the Bible, sure, he sometimes sends these things as judgment, but not very often. He is at work in them and through them, but he doesn't usually send them. So in that case, why is there so much suffering and where does it come from? Well, number one, at the start of the Bible, hello again, at the start of the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 to 2, it's clear that suffering of any kind was not part of God's created order. Before humanity took the decision to rebel against God, there was no suffering in this world. Further, in the last book of the Bible, it's clear that when God restores or recreates the heavens and the earth, he will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Every tear wiped away. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. In between times, John Stott summarizes the current state of affairs like this. According to the Bible, sin is an alien intrusion into God's good world, and it will have no part in his new universe. It is a satanic and destructive onslaught against the Creator. And this is especially made clear in that book of Job, which is well worth a read. Don't steer clear of it. It was clear also from Jesus' ministry. We read in Acts that he went about healing all who were under the power of the devil. Number 2, much but not all. Here it comes. That's it, gone too far. Go back one. Much but not all of our current day, it's great when it works, isn't it? Much but not all of our current day suffering is due to modern day sin. Sickness and death entered the world when humanity rebelled, but I'm now talking about personal day-to-day sin or misuse of our freedom, which might be a better way of thinking about it, misuse of our freedom. If I drink too much alcohol and drive a car dangerously, causing an accident, that is my personal sin. God loves us as a perfect parent, and he's given us free will. We can choose to love God or not. We have free will to do that. But only love out of free will is true love. If God forced us to love him and to love each other by taking away our free will, that would not be genuine love. If a parent or a marriage partner misuses free will and abuses a child or their spouse, that is due to personal sin. Many of our wars and disasters are due to the sins of others. Some of the starvation in our world is due to unequal food distribution caused by civil war or hatred or greed or sin of other kind. Do you know, even the coal disaster that I referred to earlier, where that coal tip slid down and covered that school in 1966, that I mentioned earlier, even that was not a natural disaster. Lord Justice Davis found that the coal board was responsible. It was corporate sin. And in Nicky Gumbel's book, Searching Issues, he quotes a letter from a woman who had contributed to the Aberfan Disaster Fund. And she wrote this. She wrote, "I raged against God, but then I realized it had happened because of man's greed and incompetence." So whilst it's true that some suffering is caused by personal sin, ours, mine, or someone else's, we must also remember from the book of Job that it's not true that all personal suffering is due to personal sin. It is not true that all personal suffering is due to personal sin. Number 3, some of our suffering is due to our sensitivity to pain. Misfortune is made worse by the hurt that we feel, both physical and emotional. But Philip Yancey writes, "Thank God for inventing pain. I don't think he could have done a better job. It's beautiful." I know that sounds odd, but what does he mean? He said this because our pain sensors give us valuable warning signals which are essential for survival. Nerve reactions must hurt for us to be able to protect ourselves. Number 4, some suffering is caused by the world in which we live, so-called natural disasters. And whilst most human suffering is caused by human sin, and some estimates put that at about 95%, there is also a great deal of suffering caused by the convulsions of our world. Science explains how volcanoes erupt, how earthquakes and tsunamis occur, and how violent weather develops. And the Bible describes this in today's reading like this. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. It can be argued that people should not live in the more inhospitable parts of our world, but people go on living there, understandably and often encouraged by governments. Of course, many people have no means by which to move. It could be argued that humanity plunders the earth in an irresponsible way, making some disasters far worse, such as the tsunami in Japan, followed by the problems with the nuclear reactors on the beach. But even then, we're left with a world that is both beautiful and calm and wild and dangerous. It's a world created perfect, but jilted out of perfection, seriously jilted out of perfection by rebellion against God. First by Satan and then by humanity. A world that eagerly waits to be restored or rebooted when God brings this part of time to an end and creates a new heaven and a new earth. But how do we respond in the meantime to suffering? First, we all need to look in and to look up. We need to look in and to look up. We need to look into ourselves, to be honest about our own sin and the suffering that our own sin causes. My sin causes me to suffer, and it causes other people to suffer. I need to repent of that, to look up, to be changed by Christ. And as we deal with sin in our lives and allow Christ to forgive and deal with sin, to change us, our homes, our families, our church, our world will change. And I'm sure that's what we all want. We want to see a better world, don't we? Second, we must get deeply involved in situations of suffering. We must never point a finger saying things like, it's their fault. They brought it upon themselves. And I hear that so often. I hear it from some of you. But we mustn't say these things. It's their fault. They brought it upon themselves. They declared war. They drank too much. They took drugs. They had an affair. They blew all their money. God doesn't treat us like that. And the scriptures clearly tell believers to get involved. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, two religious men walked on by with their noses in the air. Whereas a Samaritan with some very strange religious views, very unorthodox religious views, did the right thing and was shown to be the true neighbour. So controversially, I could say that you could find a situation where the modern-day Samaritan could be a Mormon with some very strange beliefs. Or maybe some Christians with some very odd beliefs that we might not naturally agree with. Or maybe some people that believe in God and have a real faith in Jesus but never show up at church. They are the modern-day Samaritans in that parable. If they meet the needs of someone in distress and we do not, who is doing the will of God? Third, remember and ponder on the cross. For it was at the cross, in Christ, that God suffered. As Jürgen Moltmann, the German theologian, put it, he is the crucified God. Jesus knows what it means to suffer. He knew hunger. He knew bereavement. He wept at the grave of his good friend Lazarus. He knew physical pain as he was whipped, beaten, and crucified. He knew spiritual, emotional pain as he cried out, quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Of course, it's a psalm that later reiterates faith in God, even though the circumstances are dire. Fourth, we need to know that sometimes we will suffer for Christ, for his name, for our faith in him, for following him. Fifth, remember that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Out of evil, God can bring good. Out of bereavement, God can bring new perspective and new life. Out of personal failure, God can bring forgiveness and reconciliation. I'm going to end with a short story which is called The Long Silence. Some of you will already know it, but I think it's very relevant to what I've said today. At the end of time, billions of people were seated on a great plain before God's throne. Most shrank back from the brilliant light before them. But some groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but with belligerence. Can God judge us? How can he know about suffering? Snapped a young brunette. She ripped open a sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endured terror, beatings, torture and death. In another group, a Negro boy lowered his collar. What about this? He demanded. And he showed an ugly rope burn. I was lynched for no crime but being black. In another crowd, there was a pregnant schoolgirl with sullen eyes. Why should I suffer? She murmured. It wasn't my fault. Far out across the plain were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he or she had Going too fast. Each group had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he had permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven, where all was sweetness and light, where there was no weeping or fear, no hunger or hatred. What did God know of all that man had been forced to endure in this world? For God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each of these groups sent a leader, chosen because he had suffered the most. A Jew, a Negro, a person from Hiroshima, a horribly deformed arthritic, a thalidomide child. In the center of the vast plain, they consulted with each other. At last, they were ready to present their case, and it was rather clever. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. Let him be born a Jew. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted. Give him a work so difficult that even his family will think him out of his mind. Let him be betrayed by his closest friends. Let him face false charges, be tried by a prejudiced jury, and be convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him be tortured. At the last, let him see what it means to be terribly alone. Then let him die, so that there can be no doubt he died. Let there be a great host of witnesses to verify it. And as each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the throng of people assembled. And when the last had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered a word. No one moved. For suddenly everyone knew that God had already served his sentence.